Sarah Johnson wiped down the counter at Miller's Diner for the third time that evening, her dark hands moving in practiced circles across the worn formica surface. The small roadside restaurant in Bakersfield, California had been her workplace for almost 2 years, and she knew every scratch, every stain, every story these tables could tell. At 28, Sarah had learned to read people quickly. She could spot trouble walking through the door before it even ordered coffee. The bell above the entrance chimed, and Sarah looked up to see a lone figure stepping into the fluorescent light. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the unmistakable leather vest of a motorcycle club. Patches covered his back and chest, declaring his allegiance to one of the most notorious biker gangs in the country. His boots clicked against the checkered linoleum as he surveyed the nearly empty diner. 3 other customers sat scattered across the restaurant that Tuesday night in March. An elderly couple shared a piece of apple pie in the corner booth, their weathered hands intertwined on the table. A long-haul trucker nursed his 3rd cup of coffee at the counter, fighting sleep before his next run. The atmosphere was peaceful, almost sleepy, until the biker's presence changed everything. Sarah watched as the man's eyes swept the room before settling on the elderly couple. Something in his expression made her stomach tighten. She had seen that look before. The predatory gleam that meant someone weaker was about to become a target. The biker approached their table with deliberate slowness, his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet space. "You folks need to move," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I want this booth." The elderly man, probably in his 70s, looked up with confusion. "Excuse me, son. We're still eating our dessert." The biker leaned down, placing both hands on their table. "I said move now." Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she watched the scene unfold. The elderly woman's hands began to shake, her fork clattering against the plate. Her husband's face flushed red with a mixture of fear and indignation. But at his age, what could he do against someone half his age and twice his size? "Please," the old man said quietly. "We'll be finished in just a few minutes." The biker's laugh was cold and humorless. "You'll be finished now, old-timer. Unless you want me to help you understand what now means." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Sarah could see the elderly couple gathering their things with trembling hands, their romantic evening destroyed by one man's cruelty. The trucker at the counter kept his eyes fixed on his coffee cup, unwilling to get involved. This was how it always went, Sarah realized. Good people got pushed around because nobody wanted to stand up to the bullies. But something inside Sarah refused to accept this. Maybe it was because she had been raised by a grandmother who never backed down from what was right. Maybe it was because she had faced her own share of bullies throughout her life. Or maybe it was simply because she was tired of watching innocent people get hurt while everyone else looked away. Sarah untied her apron and walked out from behind the counter. Her sneakers made soft sounds against the floor as she approached the booth where the confrontation was taking place. The biker was still looming over the elderly couple, enjoying their fear. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The biker turned toward her, surprise flickering across his features. He clearly hadn't expected anyone to interrupt his intimidation session. "There's no problem here," Sarah continued, stepping between the biker and the elderly couple. "These folks are paying customers just like anyone else. They have every right to finish their meal in peace." The biker straightened to his full height, using his size to try to intimidate her just as he had the elderly couple. "Lady, you need to mind your own business before you get hurt." Sarah looked up at him without flinching. At 5 feet 4 inches, she was dwarfed by his bulk, but she refused to be cowed. "This is my business. This is where I work, and these are my customers. You want a table? There are plenty of empty ones. You want to cause trouble? There's the door." The tension in the diner became thick enough to cut. The trucker finally looked up from his coffee, sensing that something significant was happening. The elderly couple sat frozen, unsure whether to flee or stay. The biker's face darkened with anger at being challenged, especially by someone he clearly considered beneath his notice. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Do you see these patches? Do you understand what they mean?" Sarah nodded slowly. "I see them. And I don't care. In here, you're just another customer. You follow the same rules as everyone else." For a long moment, the biker stared at her in disbelief. Nobody talked to him like this. Nobody challenged his authority. His reputation, his gang affiliation, his physical presence, these things usually ended conversations before they started. But this young black woman was standing her ground, protecting two people she didn't even know, facing down someone who could easily hurt her. The standoff stretched on, neither backing down, while the entire diner held its breath and waited to see what would happen next. The silence stretched between Sarah and the biker like a taut wire ready to snap, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, and Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out across his weathered features. He was clearly accustomed to people cowering before him, to his reputation clearing rooms and ending arguments before they began. Yet here stood this waitress barely reaching his shoulder, refusing to budge. "You have no idea what you're messing with," he said finally, his voice barely above a growl. The patches on his vest seemed to gleam under the harsh diner lights, each one a symbol of violence and brotherhood that most people understood meant stay away. Sarah took a small step forward instead of backing away. "Maybe not, but I know right from wrong. And bullying elderly people is wrong, no matter who you are." Behind her, she could hear the elderly woman whisper to her husband, "Harold, maybe we should just go." But Harold, perhaps inspired by Sarah's courage, spoke up from his seat. "No, Martha. We paid for our meal and we're going to finish it." His voice wavered slightly, but there was steel beneath the fear. The biker's attention shifted between Sarah and the old man, his frustration growing. This wasn't how these situations were supposed to unfold. A single word from him usually sent people scurrying. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, and for good reason. But somehow this situation had spiraled out of his control. The trucker at the counter slowly turned on his stool, finally engaging with what was happening. "Everything okay over there?" he called out, his voice carefully neutral but his message clear. Sarah wasn't alone anymore. Something shifted in the biker's expression. Perhaps it was the realization that the entire diner was now watching him, waiting to see what kind of man he really was. Perhaps it was something in Sarah's unwavering gaze that reminded him of someone from his past. Or perhaps buried beneath years of leather and anger and reputation, there was still a part of him that remembered what his mother had taught him about treating people with respect. He looked down at Sarah one more time, studying her face as if trying to memorize it. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward an empty booth on the opposite side of the diner. His boots echoed against the floor, but the sound was somehow different now, less menacing and more like a retreat. Sarah remained standing for a moment, hardly believing what had just happened. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was beginning to fade, leaving her slightly shaky. She turned back to the elderly couple who were staring at her with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her professional demeanor returning. Martha reached out and grasped Sarah's hand. "Thank you, dear." "That was very brave of you," Harold nodded vigorously. Most people would have looked the other way. "You didn't have to do that." Sarah squeezed Martha's hand gently. "Yes, I did. Nobody deserves to be treated like that." She glanced over at the biker who had settled into his booth and was studying the menu with intense concentration. Something about his posture suggested he was listening to every word of their conversation, though he gave no outward sign of it. Sarah returned to the counter and poured a cup of coffee. The trucker watched her approach the biker's table, his eyebrows raised in surprise. Most people would have refused service or at least made their displeasure known. But Sarah set the coffee down in front of the biker with the same professional courtesy she showed every customer. "Coffee," she said simply. "Menu's right there if you want to order something." The biker looked up at her, and for a split second she saw something unexpected in his eyes. It might have been respect or confusion, or perhaps just surprise that she was treating him like a normal person after what had just happened. "Thanks," he said quietly. The first civil word he had spoken since entering the diner. Sarah nodded and walked away, returning to her duties as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. She refilled the trucker's coffee, cleared a few tables, and generally went about her business while keeping one eye on both the elderly couple and the biker. The elderly couple finished their pie slowly, clearly reluctant to leave while the situation remained uncertain. The biker ordered a burger and ate in silence, occasionally glancing in their direction, but making no further moves to bother them. When Harold finally helped Martha to her feet, and they prepared to leave, the biker didn't even look up from his plate. As they passed Sarah at the counter, Martha pressed a $20 bill into her hand. "For your courage, dear. The world needs more people like you." Before Sarah could protest, they were gone, the bell chiming softly behind them. She looked down at the bill in her hand, then over at the biker who was finishing his meal. He caught her looking and held her gaze for a moment before dropping some money on the table and standing up. He walked toward the door, pausing just long enough to look back at her. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sarah," she replied, not sure why she was answering. He nodded once as if filing the information away somewhere important. "I'm Jake," he said, then pushed through the door and disappeared into the night. The trucker let out a long whistle. "Lady, you either have nerves of steel or you're completely crazy." "Maybe both." Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee with hands that were finally steady again. "Maybe you're right." But as she watched Jake's motorcycle disappear down the highway, she had no idea that her act of courage had set something in motion that would change her life forever. Sarah arrived at Miller's Diner the next morning expecting another ordinary Wednesday. The events of the previous night felt almost surreal in the bright California sunshine, like something that had happened to someone else. She had replayed the confrontation in her mind during the drive to work, alternating between pride in her actions and amazement at her own boldness. The morning rush was typical for a weekday. Construction workers grabbed coffee and donuts before heading to job sites. Office workers picked up breakfast sandwiches on their way to downtown Bakersfield. Retired folks settled into their regular booths with newspapers and endless refills. Sarah moved through her routine with practiced efficiency, taking orders, pouring coffee, and making small talk with the regulars who formed the backbone of Miller's customer base. Around 10:30, as the breakfast crowd began to thin out, Sarah was wiping down tables when she heard the unmistakable rumble of motorcycles approaching. The sound grew louder and more complex, suggesting not just one bike but several. She glanced toward the windows but couldn't see much through the morning glare on the glass. The rumbling stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of multiple engines shutting off in quick succession. Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. Yesterday's encounter with Jake had ended peacefully, but she knew enough about motorcycle gangs to understand that conflicts rarely ended with just one conversation. The bell above the door chimed, and Jake walked in wearing the same leather vest adorned with patches. But he wasn't alone. Behind him came another biker, then another, then another. Sarah counted them as they filed through the door, her heart rate increasing with each new arrival. 5, 6, 7, 8. When the count reached 12, she stopped counting and focused on staying calm. The other customers in the diner noticed immediately. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. The atmosphere shifted from comfortable morning routine to tense uncertainty. Several customers glanced toward the exit, clearly debating whether to leave. Sarah stood behind the counter, her hand resting on the coffee pot, trying to read the situation. The bikers weren't loud or obviously threatening, but their presence filled the small diner completely. They wore the same patches as Jake, marking them as members of the same notorious gang. Their leather vests displayed years of insignia, each patch telling a story that most law-abiding citizens preferred not to know. Jake approached the counter while the others spread out throughout the diner, some taking seats at tables, others remaining standing. His expression was unreadable, giving Sarah no clue about his intentions or mood. "Morning, Sarah," he said, his voice neutral. "Morning," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "Coffee? That would be good. For all of us." Sarah began filling cups, her movements automatic despite her racing thoughts. She could feel the eyes of every customer in the diner watching her, waiting to see what would happen. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the clink of ceramic and the soft sounds of coffee being poured. As she worked, Sarah studied the faces of the other bikers. They were an intimidating group, clearly battle-tested men with scars and calloused hands that spoke of hard lives and harder choices. But something was off about their demeanor. They weren't acting like people who had come looking for trouble. Instead, they seemed almost respectful. One of the younger bikers, probably in his 20s, kept glancing around the diner as if he had never been in such a normal place before. An older biker with gray streaking his beard sat quietly at a corner table, his weathered hands folded in front of him like he was in church. Another man, heavily tattooed with arms like tree trunks, was actually reading the menu with serious concentration. Sarah finished pouring the coffee and began distributing cups to the various tables. Each biker thanked her politely as she served them, their voices low and courteous. The contrast between their fearsome appearance and their respectful behavior was striking. When she returned to the counter, Jake was still standing there, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "You're probably wondering why we're here," he said quietly. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Around them, the other customers were beginning to relax slightly as it became clear that no immediate violence was forthcoming. "Word travels fast in our world," Jake continued. "What you did last night standing up for those old folks, it got people talking. See, most people think they know who we are, what we're about. They see the patches and the bikes and they make assumptions." He paused to sip his coffee, gathering his thoughts. "Truth is, we got mothers and grandmothers too. We got people we care about who could end up in a situation like those folks last night. And when we heard that a waitress, a young black woman, had the courage to stand up to one of us, to do the right thing when everyone else was looking away, well, that got our attention." Sarah found her voice. "I just did what anyone should have done." Jake shook his head. "No, you did what most people should do but don't. There's a difference." One of the other bikers, the older man with the gray beard, approached the counter. He moved with the careful dignity of someone who had learned hard lessons about respect and honor. "Miss," he said, his voice gravelly but gentle, "my name is Red. I'm the president of this chapter. Jake here told us what happened last night, how you stood up for what was right even though you were scared." Sarah glanced between Jake and Red, still trying to understand what was happening. Red continued, "We wanted to come here today to let you know that what you did, it matters. In our world, respect has to be earned and courage has to be recognized. You earned both last night." The morning sun streamed through the diner windows, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. Customers who had been ready to flee were now listening intently, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Sarah stood behind the counter, surrounded by some of the most feared men in the state, and realized that her simple act of standing up for two elderly strangers had somehow bridged a gap she never knew existed. Red reached into his leather vest and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He placed it gently on the counter in front of Sarah, his calloused fingers handling it with obvious care. The image showed an elderly African-American woman sitting on a porch swing, her smile warm and welcoming despite the lines of hardship etched around her eyes. "That's my grandmother Ethel," Red said softly. "Raised me after my parents died in a car wreck when I was 8. Strongest woman I ever knew. Worked 3 jobs to keep me fed and in school. She's been gone 10 years now, but I still think about her every day." Sarah looked down at the photograph, then back up at Red's weathered face. She could see genuine emotion in his eyes as he spoke about his grandmother. "Ethel used to tell me that character ain't about how tough you are or how much people fear you. It's about standing up for folks who can't stand up for themselves. It's about doing right even when doing right is hard or dangerous." He tapped the photograph with one finger. "She would have done exactly what you did last night." Jake stepped closer to the counter. "Red's not the only one with family like that. Most of us got people we love. People who taught us about honor and respect before life got complicated." Another biker, the heavily tattooed man who had been studying the menu, spoke up from his table. "My mom's 73, lives alone in Sacramento. Every time I see her, I worry about what might happen if someone decided to mess with her when I'm not around." He looked directly at Sarah. "What you did last night, that gives me hope that there are still people like you in the world." Sarah felt the weight of their words settling on her shoulders. These men, whom she had feared just moments ago, were revealing themselves to be sons and grandsons, people with families and memories and consciences. It was a side of them that the world rarely saw, hidden beneath the leather and the reputation and the patches that proclaimed their allegiance to a lifestyle most people would never understand. "We're not saying we're angels," Red continued, carefully tucking the photograph back into his vest. "We've made choices, lived a life that puts us outside what most folks consider acceptable. But that doesn't mean we don't understand right from wrong. And it doesn't mean we don't respect it when we see it." The young biker who had been looking around the diner with wide eyes finally spoke up. "My name's Tommy. I've only been with the club for 6 months. Last night was the first time I ever heard of someone standing up to us instead of just backing down or calling the cops." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "It made me think about why someone would do that. I mean, you had to know it was dangerous. You had to know Jake could have hurt you, but you did it anyway, for people you didn't even know." Sarah found herself opening up despite her nervousness. My grandmother raised me too after my mother passed when I was 12. She always said that if you see something wrong happening and you don't speak up, then you're part of the problem. She said silence in the face of injustice is just another form of cowardice. Red nodded slowly. Smart woman. Sounds like she and my Ethel would have gotten along just fine. The atmosphere in the diner had completely transformed. Other customers who had been preparing to leave were now settling back into their seats, drawn in by the unexpected conversation unfolding at the counter. The elderly couple's empty booth seemed to represent something larger now, a symbol of vulnerability that everyone could understand and relate to. Jake leaned against the counter, his earlier intimidating presence replaced by something more thoughtful. The thing is, Sarah, what you did last night changed something. Not just for those old folks, but for us too. See, we're used to people being afraid of us or trying to use us or wanting something from us. But you just stood up for what was right, without expecting anything in return. That's rare, added. Rarer than you might think. One of the bikers at a corner table raised his coffee cup in a toast to doing the right thing even when it's hard. The others followed suit, a dozen leather-clad men raising their coffee cups in tribute to a waitress who had shown more courage than most people would ever be called upon to display. Sarah found herself raising her own cup, participating in perhaps the most unusual toast in Miller's diner history. As they drank their coffee, the bikers began sharing stories about their own families, their own experiences with courage and cowardice, respect and disrespect. They talked about their mothers and wives and daughters, about times when they had been helped by strangers and times when they had been judged unfairly. Tommy told about his sister, a nurse who worked in an inner-city emergency room, treating gunshot wounds and drug overdoses with the same compassion she showed everyone else. Another biker spoke about his daughter, away at college studying to become a teacher, someone who had chosen a completely different path from her father, but who still called him every Sunday. Red shared memories of his grandmother Ethel, how she had never backed down from bullies in their neighborhood, how she had protected other children from abuse and neglect, even when it put her own safety at risk. She taught me that strength isn't about how much damage you can do, he said. It's about how much good you can do, even when the world's trying to drag you down. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting different shadows across the diner floor. What had started as a tense confrontation had evolved into something none of them had expected, a conversation about honor, family, and the choices that define who we really are beneath the surface. As the conversation continued, Sarah began to understand that something significant was happening, something that went far beyond a simple thank you visit. The bikers weren't just sharing stories. They were revealing a code of honor that existed within their world, a set of principles that guided their actions even when those actions weren't visible to outsiders. Red set down his empty coffee cup and looked around the diner, taking in the other customers who had been listening to their conversation with growing fascination. An office worker in a rumpled suit had abandoned his newspaper entirely. 2 construction workers had delayed leaving for their job site. Even the cook had emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron as he listened from the doorway. Sarah, Red said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had made him a leader among dangerous men. We came here today for a reason beyond just saying thank you. What you did last night, it created a debt. Sarah frowned, confused. I don't understand. I don't want anything from you. That's exactly why the debt exists, Jake explained. In our world, respect is currency. You showed respect for people who couldn't protect themselves. You showed respect for what's right, even when it was dangerous. That means something to us, Red nodded. We're not good at a lot of things that regular folks consider important. We don't fit into polite society, don't follow most of the rules that everyone else lives by, but we understand loyalty, and we understand protecting people who matter. He gestured around the diner. This place matters to you. These customers matter to you. That makes them matter to us. Tommy, the youngest member of the group, spoke up with obvious excitement. What Red's trying to say is that you're under our protection now. Anyone who wants to mess with you, with this place, with people you care about, they'll have to go through us first. Sarah stared at them in amazement. You're saying you'll protect me, but why? I'm nobody special. That's where you're wrong, said the heavily tattooed biker from his corner table. You're exactly special. You proved that last night. Red reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal pin about the size of a quarter. It was simple in design but clearly meaningful, featuring the same symbol that appeared on their patches but rendered in silver rather than embroidered thread. This is a protection token, Red explained, holding it up for Sarah to see. There are maybe 50 of these in existence, given out only to people who have earned the respect of our entire organization. Family members mostly, a few others who have proven themselves in extraordinary ways. He placed the pin on the counter in front of Sarah. You wear this, and every member of our brotherhood knows that you're protected, not just by us but by every chapter across the country. We got connections in 37 states, Sarah. That's a lot of people watching out for you. Sarah stared down at the small piece of metal, hardly believing what she was hearing. I can't accept this. I just did what anyone should have done. But most people don't do it, Jake said firmly. That's the point. Most people look away, mind their own business, let bullies win because it's easier than fighting. You didn't do that. The office worker who had been listening from his table suddenly spoke up. Excuse me, but I have to say something. He stood up, his newspaper forgotten on the table. I was here last night. I saw what happened. All eyes turned to him as he continued, his voice shaking slightly with emotion. I watched that biker intimidate those elderly people, and I did nothing. I sat there drinking my coffee and told myself it wasn't my business. I'm ashamed of that. He looked directly at Sarah. What you did took real courage. You risked yourself for strangers, and you did it because it was right. If more people acted like you, the world would be a better place. The construction workers nodded in agreement. One of them called out, Lady, you got guts. Most of us would have kept our mouths shut. Red smiled for the first time since entering the diner. See, it's not just us who recognize what you did. The whole world could use more people like you. Sarah picked up the protection token, feeling its weight in her palm. It was heavier than she had expected, solid and real. The craftsmanship was excellent, clearly made by someone who took pride in their work. There are rules that come with carrying that, Red explained. You don't abuse it. Don't use it to threaten people or get special treatment. It's not a license to cause trouble. It's just a guarantee that if trouble finds you, you won't face it alone, Jake added. And if you ever need help, real help, you call this number. He handed her a business card with only a phone number printed on it. Day or night, someone will answer. Someone will come. Sarah looked around at the 12 bikers surrounding her, each one watching her with expressions of respect and expectation. These men, who struck fear into the hearts of most people they encountered, were offering her their protection and friendship based on one moment of moral courage. I still don't understand why this means so much to you, she said softly. Red's expression grew serious. Because honor is rare, Sarah. Real honor, the kind that makes you risk yourself for people you don't know, that's precious. We see a lot of ugliness in our world. A lot of people who only care about themselves. When we see someone who still believes in doing right, who still has the courage to act on those beliefs, we take notice. He gestured to his companions. Every man in this room has been judged by his appearance, written off as a criminal or a thug before anyone bothered to know who he really is. We know what it's like to be misunderstood, but we also know the difference between someone who's genuinely good and someone who's just pretending to be. The morning light streaming through the diner windows had shifted again, and Sarah realized that nearly 2 hours had passed since the bikers had arrived. What had started as a potentially terrifying encounter had become something she would remember for the rest of her life. The bikers began preparing to leave as the lunch crowd started filtering into Miller's diner. They moved with the same quiet coordination they had shown when arriving, settling their bills and gathering their leather jackets, but the atmosphere remained warm and respectful, a far cry from the tension that had filled the air when they first walked through the door. Sarah pinned the protection token to the inside of her uniform shirt, right over her heart. The small piece of metal felt warm against her skin, a tangible reminder of an extraordinary morning that had challenged everything she thought she knew about judgment, courage, and the unexpected places where honor could be found. Red was the last to approach the counter for his final goodbye. He extended his hand to Sarah, and when she shook it, his grip was firm but gentle, the handshake of someone who understood the value of respect. You changed something today, Sarah, he said quietly, not just for us but for everyone who was here to witness it. People are going to remember this morning for a long time. Around the diner, the other customers were indeed watching with expressions of amazement and reflection. The office worker who had confessed his shame was still sitting at his table, staring thoughtfully into his coffee cup. The construction workers were talking quietly among themselves, occasionally glancing in Sarah's direction with obvious admiration. Jake paused beside Red, his earlier intimidating presence completely transformed. "You know, last night when I walked in here, I was having a bad day. Problems with my ex-wife, trouble with my job, just angry at the world in general. I took it out on those old folks because I could, because nobody ever stops me." He looked down at his boots for a moment before continuing. "You did more than just protect them, Sarah. You reminded me who I used to be before life got so complicated. My grandmother would have been proud of what you did and ashamed of what I did." Sarah felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "We all make mistakes, Jake. What matters is learning from them." "That's exactly what my grandmother used to say," he replied with a sad smile. "Maybe it's time I started listening to her again, even though she's been gone 5 years now." Tommy, the youngest biker, approached with obvious nervousness. "Miss Sarah, I wanted to ask you something. I got a little sister. She's 16, still in high school. She's smart, wants to go to college, be a lawyer maybe. But she's getting mixed up with some bad people. Thinks it's cool to hang around with guys who don't respect her." He paused, struggling with his words. "I was wondering, would you maybe talk to her sometime? She won't listen to me because I'm part of the life she thinks she wants. But you showed real strength last night. Maybe she'd listen to someone like you." Sarah didn't hesitate. "Of course I'll talk to her. Bring her by any time." Tommy's relief was visible. "Thank you. Her name's Lisa, and she's a good kid underneath all the attitude. She just needs to see that there are different ways to be strong." One by one, the bikers filed out of the diner, each offering Sarah a respectful nod or a quiet word of thanks. The sound of their motorcycles starting up filled the parking lot, but somehow the noise seemed less threatening now, more like a powerful symphony than an intimidating roar. As the last bike disappeared down the highway, Sarah realized that the other customers were still staring at her. The cook emerged from the kitchen with a huge grin on his face. "In 30 years of working restaurants, I ain't never seen anything like that," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "You got bikers drinking coffee and talking about their grandmothers. That's something for the history books." The office worker finally stood up and walked over to the counter. "I know I already said this, but I wanted to thank you again. Watching you stand up for what's right even when it was dangerous, it reminded me of who I want to be." He pulled out his wallet and left a $20 tip. "For courage," he said simply. Word about the morning's events spread quickly through Bakersfield. By evening, local news crews were calling Miller's Diner, wanting to interview Sarah about her encounter with the biker gang. The story made regional news, then went viral on social media, inspiring discussions about courage, judgment, and the unexpected places where heroes could be found. Sarah declined most interview requests, preferring to let her actions speak for themselves. But she did agree to one brief interview with the local newspaper, where she emphasized that anyone could have done what she did, and that standing up for others was simply part of being human. 3 weeks later, Tommy brought his sister Lisa to the diner. The teenager was everything Tommy had described: smart, angry, and looking for strength in all the wrong places. Sarah spent an hour talking with her about real power versus fake power, about respect that had to be earned versus fear that could only be imposed. Lisa left with a different perspective and Sarah's phone number, along with an invitation to call anytime she needed someone to talk to. 6 months later, Lisa would start college with a full scholarship, having chosen books over bad boyfriends and education over easy answers. The protection token Sarah wore became a conversation starter wherever she went. When people asked about the unusual pin, she would tell them the story, always emphasizing that courage wasn't about being fearless but about doing the right thing despite being afraid. Red kept his promise. When Sarah's car broke down on a lonely highway 6 months later, a single phone call brought 3 bikers to help her, men she had never met who treated her with the respect and care they would show their own family. When a drunk customer became aggressive and threatening one evening, the word somehow reached the brotherhood, and the man found himself having a very educational conversation in the parking lot about how to treat working people with respect. But perhaps the most significant change was in Sarah herself. The young woman who had always tried to avoid confrontation discovered that standing up for others became easier with practice. She became known throughout Bakersfield as someone who would speak up when others remained silent, who would help when others looked away. Years later, when Sarah opened her own restaurant, a small framed photograph sat on the wall behind the cash register. It showed a diverse group of people sitting around tables in Miller's Diner: bikers and construction workers, office employees and retirees, all sharing coffee and conversation on a morning when courage bridged the gaps between different worlds. The caption beneath the photograph read simply, "The day we learned that honor has no uniform, and courage comes in all colors."